go through these questions and we'll give some little answers to these. So first question, when do you work on aerodynamics? How do you do it? And when would you phase it into the program? Well, the answer really is you want to work on that constantly. You know, it's not something that you just do for 2 months a year. It's something that you should always be looking to see what you can find and see what you can do in terms of making gains. The way you do something like that is you first need to establish a baseline. So if you're you want to do it really at a time in your program when mostly you would probably do it during the strength phase, because you're not going to be seeing any big and sudden changes in that. What you want to try and work out is if you're doing multiple efforts over a session, if you're doing the same effort multiple times, like doing 4 flying 200s, for example, you would say, well, what's typical for me in terms of drop off between each effort? So for me, for example, I know that I tend to drop off by 1/10 of a second each effort going through the session. So if I do 11.6 first effort, my next effort's going to be 11.7, 11.8, third one's going to be 11.8, 11.9, fourth one's going to be about 12 seconds. And I know that because I've paid attention to it over a long period of time. I know that's roughly what my drop-off is. So what I'll do is each effort, I'll try something different. So I'll try standing up at a different point, sitting down at a different point, bending my arms differently, tucking my head differently. And I'll know what my time should be, if that makes sense. I'll know that whatever my first effort was, I should reduce by about 1/10 going on to the next one. So then I'll say, well, did I reduce by 1/10, or did I do a similar time, or did I go faster? And if I did a similar time or faster, then I know that the change I've made has been a beneficial one. Whereas if I drop 2 or 3 tenths, then I know that actually the change I've made is not a beneficial one. And this isn't a hard and fast rule, but it's a good way of doing that testing over the course of a session, which is that you use each effort as its own individual testing thing, and you're always trying to find something that works. So yeah, I mean, I suppose the answer really to aerodynamics is do it all the time, but especially during your strength phase, because that's when your drop-off times are going to be quite predictable. And yeah, if you've got things you want to try it in each different effort and compare what your drop-off ends up being to what you think it should be or what you've established it normally is. And that will give you an idea. And then from there, you can test it again. You can try it in different situations. You can say, does this only work for a 200, or does it work for individual sprint? Does it work for standing laps? And you'll start to get an idea. You start to get a bigger picture of the overall. Move on to the next question. With modern IP and TP so fast, how much of what used to be sprint training would they now include? I've been told that they do start to include more of that. I think that's probably for the start and for the opening laps. I would actually say not much, because it goes back to what I was talking about in the terms of the difference between endurance and sprint. Even the most powerful team pursuiter is not doing over 1,000 watts whilst they're on the front. They might be doing 600, 700 watts. That's still very much an endurance effort. It's not really tapping into those super high-end energy systems. So I would actually say, although I don't know for certain, I would say I'd be surprised if they do a lot. I think they probably do quite a lot of strength training. I think they probably do a fair bit of weights and quite a lot in the gym. But I don't think they would do any real sprint training on the bike as such. How much of their training do tandem pairs do together? It's sort of...
Depends if they're married.
As my wife says, depends if they're married. It depends, really. It depends on how well they work together. If it's a pairing where one of them is visually impaired or is perhaps not a great cyclist, or if there's a big mismatch, then you probably want to do quite a lot of training together. Whereas if you've got two riders who are good individual riders, then and work well together, then they could quite reasonably do a lot of training apart from each other and only come together for big competitions. That being said, generally, generally a disabled or a VI rider will have to do their training together with their pilot. But yeah, if you're talking about two riders who are both skilled individual riders and just come together for competitions, then actually they don't need to do a huge amount of training. I'm told that in BC, the endurance athletes actually do most of their training apart. I think it's probably less important to be perfectly synced for endurance than it is for sprint. Whereas for sprint, you really need to be together like that. Weighted squats, how deep to be effective, and weights or reps. Well, I'm sort of going to repeat what I said earlier, which I'm not a strength coach. So that's not really my area. In terms of how deep, I would say a squat is a squat. You sort of want to go full depth. You can do partial squats, and they are thought to be, a little bit more sprint specific, but it also puts a huge amount of stress on things like your knee joints and your cartilage. And if you haven't built up that base of strength by doing those full depth squats, that can lead to injury really quickly. So I would sort of say with stuff like that, don't get too fancy about it. Go and find a gym coach, go and find a strength coach, and do squats in the same way that a power lifter or a strongman would. Do proper squats. Don't try and do some fancy, sprint specific version. And in terms of weight and reps, well, you're going to start out, with conditioning. When you're starting out, you are going to be doing higher reps, lower weights. As you get closer towards your competition, you're going to be doing really, really as heavy as you can. You're going to be doing maybe sets of 5, sets of 3, perhaps even just singles, with basically as much weight as you can lift, whatever that ends up being. But you're going to cycle and you're going to build up to that. You're not just going to go straight in. So you might, hypothetically, and this is not me saying do this, but this is roughly what I'm going to be doing over the next few months. At the moment, I'm doing 3 sets of 15 with a couple of minutes rest, and I'm going to be doing that for about 3 weeks. Then I'm going to gradually, over the course of a couple of weeks, start moving down to 3 sets of 8, and moving the weights up and up to about 70 or 80 kilos. And I'm going to do that for maybe 8 weeks. And then I'm going to do maybe a month of getting down to like heavy singles or doubles at 100 plus. And then I'm going to take a week or so off, and I'm going to go back and start the cycle again, hoping to reach a higher peak next time. So that's the sort of thing that I'm going to do, but that's not necessarily what I suggest you do. I suggest you go and get like some proper strength coaching advice. Is the training for a team sprint rider very much, was very different from that of an individual sprinter? For man 2, it would be pretty similar. For man 1, it would be very different. For man 1, you wouldn't do any speed endurance training. It would all just be focus on pure snap and power. You don't need any speed endurance because you're not doing that type of riding. So yeah, it would be different. And then rider number 3, they're going to be training a bit more like a kilo rider. So they're going to have a real massive emphasis on the speed endurance to a greater extent than a normal, than sort of a normal match sprinter would need. So essentially the answer is rider number 2 is going to train pretty much the same way as a match sprinter would. Rider number 1 is going to have a lot less emphasis on speed endurance and a lot more emphasis on snap and power. And rider 3 is going to have a bit less emphasis on the snap and the power and a lot more emphasis on the speed endurance. How will you know the gear you choose is the right one as you're training from beginner to advance? Find what works for you. try lots of gears, and the the gear that makes you go fastest is your race gear. If you're training strength, put the biggest gear on your bike you can possibly fit on. If you're training power, you want to be nice and snappy, so you want a nice light gear. I wouldn't go lower than 80 inches, but we can definitely train power on like 83, 84, which is very, very small gear. And in terms of your actual sprint gear, generally speaking, you use your fastest gear for your flying 200s. So just play around, experiment, find out what that gear is. And then for the actual match sprint, you normally go down about 4 gear inches to give you a bit more acceleration. But it also depends on some other factors as well. So if you're riding a 3 or a 4 up, those tend to speed up quite soon in the event. So there's less emphasis on acceleration. So you might want to ride a slightly bigger, faster gear. And in a match sprint, which often stays a lot slower to start with, you might gear down a bit to give yourself more of a kick. It also depends on exactly what your 200 gear is, what your sort of preferred cadence is. If you're riding your 200 at 140 RPM, if that turns out to be fastest for you, then you might not need to change your gear at all, because actually that you're going to have plenty of acceleration there. If you're a rider like me and you ride your 200 at about 110 RPM, you probably will need to change gear significantly for the sprint, because you just won't have enough acceleration. So it depends, but play around, experiment, find out what works for you. Does weight play much of a role for a sprinter? It plays a role in standing starts. It's something like every 500, every half a kilo is like 1/10 of a second off a lap, something like that. But that's only really for the first lap. In terms of, it's tricky because generally if you're heavier, you can put out a little bit more power, but you are also going to be, you're going to accelerate a bit more slowly. It's a balance. What I would definitely say is it's much less important than it is for road endurance or anything like that. You don't need to worry about being super light or super thin or super skinny. You can be a really, really good sprinter, sort of pretty much whatever your body shape is. If you're going to really focus on doing gate starts and you really want to do well at that, then yes, you probably do want to reduce your body fat percentage as low as is reasonable. But it's not going to gain you like huge advantages. Like, it's not going to get you seconds and seconds to be as skinny as possible. So it depends. So we got, I would like the UCI rules changed to say that all tandem pairs should be married. Pad on the bar for squats, yay or nay? No, stop being such a wimp. Do you encourage versatility in riders in terms of competing across different disciplines events, or do you recommend specialization? Do what you want to do, seriously. In terms of being a really, really specialized rider, if you want to be the very best at any particular discipline, you do have to specialize. But the bar at which you need to make that decision to specialize is a lot higher than people think it is. I would say if you want to win a national title, you probably have to specialize. If you want to do well in your local track league, you don't, God knows you don't have to specialize. You know, you can be a superb endurance rider and still be competitive in a sprint. You can be a superb sprinter and still be competitive in endurance, right the way up to actually a very, very high level. So the answer really is, do you want to specialize? I mean, I'm a sprinter, but I ride Madison. I ride a bit of individual pursuit. I essentially do what I want. And I'm not saying I'm the best sprinter in the world, but actually I'm not that bad. And there are certainly much better sprinters than me who do very, very well in the endurance events as well. So yeah, it's you can specialize, but you don't have to. Yes, I completely agree. All tandem pairs should be married, although my lovely wife disagrees. That might be a bit of a problem because James Fosbury and I have agreed to ride the National Tandem Championships next year.
You're not divorcing me.
James, I'm going to be committing bigamy. I hope you are happy about that.
James, hands off.
He's not there. He'll probably see this eventually. So I think that brings us. Yes, I know we'd be a cute couple. So yeah, I think that brings us to.
At least he's taller than that.
I think that brings us to the end. So, hello.
Hi.
You realise this is going on YouTube?
Yes.